In our last section, we will introduce the concept of value proposition. So this is an important concept in terms of policy analysis. So those of you that decide to go into policy analysis will see a lot of this later in your education. So we're going to use the supply and demand framework to analyze value. So specifically, demand tells us the willingness to pay of the consumer. So this means that for a given quantity, we know the price a consumer is willing to pay. So conversely, for the firm, the supply curve tells us the firm's willingness to accept. So at a given quantity, a firm will accept a particular price. So the difference between this willingness to pay and willingness to accept is our theory of value. We can graphically represent this as the area between the supply and demand curves to the left of our equilibrium quantity. So let's break this down a little bit. So considering the consumer side, this is the triangle at the top of our total area. So it's everywhere above our equilibrium price P star and everywhere below our demand curve. So how do we interpret this as value or consumer surplus? Well, we know that the consumer in equilibrium is paying P star, but given their demand curve, they were willing to pay a higher price for all of those units prior to Q star. So the fact that they didn't have to pay that higher price, there's some inherent value in paying that lower equilibrium price. On the producer side, this part of the triangle is what we call producer surplus. So we can interpret this as profit for the firm. It's a little bit more concrete than the idea of consumer surplus. So this is everywhere below P star, but above our supply function. And remember that our supply function represents our marginal cost. So the difference between the price you receive in the market and the cost of that good, that tells us profit. Summing up that whole area from Q of 0 all the way up to Q star gives us the profit a firm receives selling at price P star, quantity Q star. So let's look at this in a little more detail. So in this example, we are increasing the quantity demanded. And how are we doing this? Well, we are assuming that there's some quality improvements in the product that the consumers are demanding. So if consumers value these quality improvements, we're going to have an increase in demand. So we see that as the demand curve shifts out. For any given quantity, consumers are willing to pay more because now they value the product more. So that yellow shape we see at the top of our gray triangle, that's the additional value created from these quality improvements. So what about value increases if cost falls? So if a producer becomes more efficient, then the cost of producing each unit will fall. So we see that as we shift the supply curve, or rotate the supply curve, I should say, from supply at 0 to supply at 1. And that gives us an increase in value as seen in that yellow triangle. And our quantity increases from 0 to quantity 1. So even though we have this quantity increase, our equilibrium price declines. Because remember, that is the relationship for demand. An increase in quantity will have a decrease in price.